Join me on an inspiring journey through the world of fitness, health, and performance with the Genetic Coach, where I delve deep into the genetic foundations of athletic endurance, discovering how genetics is revolutionizing our understanding of human potential and how we can unlock our full athletic capabilities through a fresh perspective on conventional practices. Hello again, and thanks so much for joining me this week. We have spoken in the past 2 weeks about how genetics is informing our training practices and decisions, and now this week we're going to be jumping to the really exciting stuff, where we're going to start taking a look at the genetics of fitness and how our unique DNA can personalize our fitness journeys, having the potential to fast track our success. But let's start unpacking what fitness genetics really means. And I'm thrilled to be joined by Chantelle Rossouw today. She is a researcher at 3x4 Genetics. Her work focuses on human performance and specifically endurance, power, injury, recovery, ergogenics, and much more. She has an academic background in human physiology and biochemistry. So welcome, Chantelle.
Thank you, Di. It's nice to be on the podcast and very excited to discuss genetics.
Excellent. So we really are going to start unwrapping the science of genetics and looking at how it contributes to our understanding of fitness and performance. And I think first off, it would be a really good intro just to give us a really simple rundown of the language we use when talking about genetic code. So how do we decipher what's in our DNA and what is the language we use around it?
Yeah, so I think for some people this might go back to high school biology, so maybe a little bit of a refresher. But I think a simple way to really think about genetics is seeing it as a code, and that, I mean, people often refer to your genetic code, and that's a very nice way to think of it as messages that your body produces to send certain directions and instructions in the body. So when we look at genetics, obviously we know that we get two sets of chromosomes, one set from our father, the other from our mother, and together those sets of chromosomes will inform what variations we get in that genetic code. Mm-hmm. So very fundamentally, our genetic code is made up of four structures or four nucleotides. So that is G, C, A, and T. And these instructions or these little codes will come together in combos of three, which we call a codon. And then a codon is read together as a little part of a message. So you have very long strings of DNA within each of your cells, and that gives the instruction for that cell to know what to produce when to turn certain things on, when to turn certain things off. And within that codon, we can sometimes pick up for certain individuals that there's a little change that has been made. So that little change or that variation is what they often call it, is also referred to as a single nucleotide polymorphism or a SNP. Uh-huh. So very commonly people will refer to SNPs. So if you ever wondered or if you've ever heard SNPs before, that is what we refer to, is that within that codon of three letters, one of the letters has been switched around. And although that sounds like it's actually quite a minor change, and in a lot of cases it is. So a lot of times when you hear of SNPs, it's actually very inconsequential, and they happen all the time. But in some cases, that change can actually lead to a big impact on the function of a specific protein, the way that a certain protein is expressed. Maybe it will start being expressed more or expressed less. Mm-hmm. So that is essentially the very fundamental part of where we can start seeing those changes in performance, in your metabolism, in your energy on a genetic level.
Okay, excellent. So, I mean, the research that you're doing with 3x4 is you're obviously looking at different systems in the body and where these changes in codons have specific impact on how the person presents and their phenotype. So how do you actually decide which codons you're going to be using in the type of information that you give out in your genetic testing?
So the way that you look at sports genetics, because it is still quite a growing field, and it is something that only recently has started becoming better researched, and the papers and the sample sizes are getting a lot bigger. But you do need a system and a methodology to actually decide what is worth considering and what is still too new to actually start looking at. So the system that we use specifically for GeneFit and also for the blueprint is the Darwin methodology. And essentially there are two foundational aspects that you have to consider. The first being, what is the scientific validity that supports that specific gene? So when we see there is the gene that has been linked to a specific, maybe they see that endurance athletes seem to have this gene more often than those who aren't endurance athletes, then there will be some scientific validity that we'll need to determine. How big were the studies that looked at that gene? How well are they structured? What are the types of athletes, and also have they been replicated, which is very important. So sometimes it might be a fluke, sometimes you picked up something but they can't actually see it in any other sample. So that is in terms of the science that we need to understand. But then there's also understanding, what do we do with that information? We also need to understand, how can we action that information? So is there actually a useful intervention that we can make, or how does that inform the training of an athlete, so that we can take that information, take that genetic information and actually translate it into better performance and better recommendations.
Okay, so I think that's a critical piece of information. So you're not just doing testing for the sake of doing testing, you're doing testing for information that is actually going to change somebody's life. In how they can apply it and what it means to them. Yeah,
because I mean, essentially there could be SNPs, and there are SNPs that are what we call high impact or high penetrance, and that's also something that's worth distinguishing as between high penetrance SNPs and lower penetrance SNPs. So a high penetrance SNP is a SNP that has a very distinct impact on the way that a human can function, or the way that a certain system can function, but they are very rare, and oftentimes they can actually be linked to a specific condition, and there isn't really much we can do about that specific condition. So
that could be something like breast cancer, for instance. Okay.
Yes. Or, for example, MSTN is another very rare SNP that has been linked to very low muscle tone.
Okay.
And we can't necessarily do a lot about that variant. So high penetrance variants we normally do not test for. On the other hand, low penetrance variants by themselves do not necessarily have a very high impact. But what we do see from the research is that a lot of low penetrance SNPs together act within a system. So we know that genes do not act by themselves. They are part of a longer, bigger biological system, whether that be within an energy metabolism system, whether that be in a system such as your lactate production, or how you can clear lactate. So if you have variances in a couple of these SNPs, then we can start looking at what the impact of that would be.
Okay. So specifically with 3x4 and how you've developed GeneFit is that you've looked at a couple of SNPs within a pathway.
Yes.
So we can understand the pathway impact on a person and what they should be doing differently in their lives, considering what that pathway, the result is.
Yes.
I think that's a really good start to us understanding the basis of all of this. And I guess, obviously, today we're looking very specifically at fitness genetics. And when we think about what is our fundamental goal when we're talking about fitness and exercise, and that is really to increase or improve on our aerobic capacity. And how do we measure in aerobic capacity? So in the scientific world, that would be measured essentially by VO2 max. And that is essentially the maximum volume of oxygen that your body can use under intense exercise. And we know that VO2 max is not only important in sort of seeing what our current fitness levels are like, but also how our fitness can improve over time. But it's also really important just in terms of general well-being, isn't it?
Yeah, so I think in terms of VO2 max and general well-being, there's been lots of research that's shown that VO2 max is a very good predictor of longevity, of experiencing what they call a health span, so being able to live a longer life, but also being healthy by the end of your life. So VO2 max is a gold standard in terms of fitness, but also research shows that it's a very good measure of overall health of an individual, because it indicates that you have a good heart, that your lungs are functioning properly, that your muscles are very good at accepting oxygen, at getting rid of waste products, of using that oxygen. So there's a lot of systems that are actually being measured when we look at VO2 max.
Yeah, okay. But now the interesting part is that people will have their genetic code enables them differently to respond to training, and how their actual VO2 max can increase over time. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so for a long time there's like research that's looked at how people respond to training, and they've always in this research discussed some individuals within the study were non-responders to the training. And it was a phenomenon for a while, until there was a group of researchers that actually looked at what do we mean when we say these people were non-responders to exercise. Is there really an individual that does not respond to training? Because that would really be quite a big health concern if you have a group of people who don't respond to training. So what are they supposed to do? And so what this study looked at was a group of individuals, and they all followed the exact same training program. So it was a very standard 20-week training program, and they tracked the individuals. So they first measured their baseline VO2 max, so that was at the beginning of the study, what their VO2 max levels were, and then again at the end of the study. So this was quite a large study, and what they found was that there was quite a lot of variation, not only for baseline VO2 max, but also once again at the end of that 20-week training program.
Okay.
And what they looked at next is what is actually causing this variance. Why are some people starting out with a low baseline and then they suddenly jump up, whereas others maybe have a high baseline but it doesn't seem to change a lot? So obviously there's a lot of factors that play a role in VO2 max.
Yes.
So there's your gender, it could be your age, altitude. It's quite a long list.
A lot of things. So how do you really then distinguish, like what part does genetics play and what part does environment play in baseline VO2 max, as well as also in terms of how you can improve VO2 max over time?
Yes, so the influence of genetics on any trait, but also on VO2 max, is by looking at heritability. So heritability is a term that refers to how much of the variance in a specific factor can be contributed to genetic variance. And the way that you determine heritability for VO2 max or for endurance or for power or for any other trait that you want to study is that you have to have a very, very large twin study. So twins are perfect for the study because they essentially have the exact same genome, and therefore you can see how small changes in the environment can actually influence a specific factor that you are studying.
Yes.
And you can also see how much the environment is contributing and how much is not being accounted for by the environment. So these twin studies usually will include like hundreds or thousands of twins, and they will do a full genome sequencing of the twins, and then essentially will research how much of this variance that they see was dependent on genetics as opposed to other environmental factors. And what we've actually seen for genetic studies in VO2 max is that when it comes to baseline VO2 max, so that is the VO2 max that would be considered before you start training, that seems to be very high, up to 72% in certain studies.
Wow.
And then obviously depending on the study it can be a little bit lower, but in general it seems to be above 60%. And then there's another factor that we can look at, and that is how does our VO2 max respond to training. So that's a little bit different because it can give us a sense of that trainability of your VO2 max. So how much improvement can you expect to see once you do start training? And studies that look at VO2 max trainability has actually found that 47% of our VO2 max trainability is influenced by genetics as well.
Oh, so that's nearly half, so that's pretty substantial.
Yes.
So it's very clear then that, have there been studies that have shown that, specifically in elite athletes, that show that predominantly in elite athletes they have a higher baseline VO2 and this higher the trainability aspect, that they just respond to training so much better than just your average person? Do you know of any studies like that at all?
So there are some studies. So usually when you look at these genetic studies, a way that they will determine which SNPs play a role in VO2 max trainability is they actually look at exactly that. They take a group of elite athletes, and then they take a group of sedentary individuals, which is usually just individuals, everyday individuals who don't really train. They maybe have done some slight have an athletic background maybe in high school, but have never reached that level of performance. And when they compare those two individuals, they actually notice that elite athletes tend to have specific genes that are more common within their population. And usually the difference is actually quite significant. So we can actually see in an elite athlete population, we see this gene 70% of the time, but in a sedentary group, maybe only 50% of the time or 40% of the time. So there we can start distinguishing what is a gene that might actually play a role in athletic performance. But that's only the first step of the process. So we need to understand the biochemistry of that. Why is it like that? Can we replicate it afterwards? But there are certainly studies that do compare elite athletes and everyday individuals.
But it's not to say that somebody who does a genetic test and is sort of interested in a certain sport and already is quite active in that sport, and say that their genetic results come back and they get told, I've got a low, you've got a low baseline VO2 max and you're going to respond slowly to training. I mean, that is not necessarily to say, well, you're never going to be an elite athlete and top in your chosen sport, is it?
No, not at all. And I think the thing to always remember with genetics is that it's a continuum. So if you think of a graph that's like normally distributed, most individuals will actually lie in the middle. And that counts for elite athletes as well, and it counts for everyday individuals as well. Some people tend to be on that 90 percentile where they have all of the beneficial genes, they have everything that will put them in that like upper level of elite performance, but it's certainly not a requirement. And there are a lot of factors that contribute to athletic performance that aren't just necessarily strictly physiological. There's a psychological factor as well. There's obviously grit within an individual. So
it's a combination of pathways and how they all come together in the perfect storm, I guess, to create this individual who's going to excel in this sport.
Certainly,
Okay, so if we look at VO2 max and we look at the type of results that you can get out of genetic testing, so you may get a result that you've got a low baseline and respond slowly to training, or on the opposite side of the spectrum, you respond well to training. How then would we, tailor our training to get the best out of what our body is made to do?
So as you said, when you look at the person's genetic profile for VO2 max, we will look at two things separately. So the first would be your baseline VO2 max, which we discussed earlier, which is where you start as a foundation, and then we will also consider what your improvement will be and how quickly you will see those improvements. So for an individual who's maybe starting with a lower genetic profile, that individual will likely start with a low baseline, and for them to start seeing improvements, the key is going to be consistency. So taking it step by step, not getting frustrated when you don't see results quickly, because it's going to be a long game. And it's also, for these individuals, it will be very important to really take the time, especially for those like long, slow runs. Make sure that you are being specific with those sessions. Or with your high intensity sessions, make sure that you keep an eye on your heart rate zones, you hit that intended goal for the session. Because each session is going to be very important to get you to where you want to be.
Okay. When we think about making improvements in VO2 max, we can look at sort of the low intensity workouts that you've just mentioned. So your really zone 1 and 2 aerobic workouts where you can hold a conversation while you're doing your workout, so they're really on that low spectrum. They have been shown to have good improvements in VO2 max. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we've got your high intensity workouts that use the anaerobic energy system, and those are super hard workouts, pushing yourself, and they also have been shown to have a pretty big impact on improving VO2 max. Does genetics tell us anything about what type of workouts a person should be doing to improve their VO2 max, or is it a generic approach, or how do we structure our training in terms of what the genetics results can give us?
Yeah, so the factors that you do want to look at as well. So as we mentioned, your genetics impact your VO2 max baseline and trainability, but they also play a role in your endurance and your power response. So what that essentially means is when I refer to endurance, that is what you would consider those lower intensity sessions. So can you sustain energy over a long period? And that energy is not going to be produced at a fast rate. It would be your aerobic energy system. So that system is very good at sustaining energy, but it's not necessarily going to give you that fast pace that you want.
Yes.
But it is very, very important for, especially if you're training for a marathon, that's something that's going to give you that distance that you need. On the other hand, then you have your power pathway. So power is, when I refer to power, it's going to be the anaerobic energy system or your glycolytic system. And the glycolytic system is very good at producing energy at a fast rate. It's for powerful movements, and it's what gives you your speed that you want. So obviously, in an ideal world, we'll have a balance of both. We'll be able to go the distance, but also like finish fast. You obviously want to get a good time.
Yeah. Ideal world.
Yeah. And that balance is actually influenced by your genetics. So some individuals will have a set of genes that will actually make them respond better to power type of training, so more higher intensity sessions, and those sessions might feel easier for them, and they also will see results quicker when they gear their training a bit more towards that type of training.
Okay.
Because they already have that genetic predisposition to have energy systems that are better at slow energy production, sustained energy production, for them it might feel easier to start seeing those incremental wins when they do easier, longer, slower sessions at a low intensity.
Okay. It's really about figuring out what type of workouts are going to work best for you, and how they will ultimately increase VO2 max at the end of the day, because that's where we want to get to.
Yes.
But it's so interesting because there's been such a fad around HIIT workouts in recent times, and how those are the best workouts for you. You're going to get the best benefits in the shortest amount of time. You know, important for fitness, important for just general health and well-being. And now you're telling me, but hang on, maybe some people are just not made to actually benefit off those type of workouts. And I think this is where it becomes so interesting, because there are these like generalized fitness fads that are out there which people are following, and potentially a lot of people are getting disillusioned because I've been told this is going to work for me, but actually it's not.
Yes.
And this is where genetics is starting to play such a big role.
Yes, definitely.
And I mean,
so I think a very good study that really touches on this was a study that was done by Jones et al. And what they looked at individuals who had a power profile, predominantly like a power genetic profile, and individuals who had a predominantly endurance genetic profile. And they made these individuals, they split them up essentially into 4 groups. So they had a group of endurance athletes or endurance genetic profiles who trained according to those endurance principles that we discussed, that are low intensity. And then also an endurance group who actually did more power training. So they almost went against that genetic profile. And the same for the power profile. And at the end of these 20 weeks, what they actually saw was the individuals who trained against their genetic profile saw fewer improvements. And in some cases, they actually saw that their metrics, so they measured VO2 max as one metric of athletic performance, and the other was a 1 rep maximum test as well, which is essentially when you are trying to, either through, I think in this case it was through a squat, see what your maximum weight is that you can do for 1 repetition.
Yes.
So it's like an output of your power for 1 repetition. And what they saw is that individuals who trained against their genetics saw fewer improvements, and then sometimes worse. Their metrics were worse after training, after following something that was against their genetic profile.
Yeah.
So there's obviously a lot that goes into training. There's a lot of factors that can play a role, but it's very clear that genetics can really help you refine that balance. Like, how much time should I spend in low intensity sessions, or should I actually become a bit more focused during my high intensity sessions, really push during those.
And I think this is what we've chatted about in previous podcasts, is just the fact that like when Kurida Ace was talking about her triathlon training and how they were, you know, a group of athletes doing the same training, and so like some athletes responded really well and others just didn't get the improvements that they were looking for. And I mean, this just explains it from such a simple standpoint. And I think you know, this is really gonna change the way people are prescribing training, not only for your performance athlete, but for people, your everyday person who just wants to get fit. And I think so many people are so pressed for time. They just really want to know, well, what is going to give me the biggest bang for my buck? I want to know what training session is going to benefit me the most. And I think this is exactly where genetic testing is taking the world of fitness and sporting performance. It's so interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also a big part of this, not just in terms of saving you time, but also in terms of really understanding your own physiology. Because as you often, when we talk about training, a lot of the times you are the person who understands your body the best. And being able to become a bit more in tune of, like, not just how do you feel during your sessions, but understanding your own unique physiology. I think it will really help people understand, why have they been struggling so much to see those improvements? Why can't they train as easily as others seem to train or do those high intensity sessions? And it's really, they really struggle to get through those sessions. I think it really helps having that context in terms of how is your body made up and what's actually going to work the best for you.
Well, thank you so much, Chantelle. This has been a wonderful session of exploration and finding out about the science. And I hope you guys will join us next time, where we'll be going into the genetics of recovery and injury and looking at how we can tailor-make our training and our recovery and our injury prevention very specifically to what our genetics is saying. So, see you next week.